Mall manager kicks out, J.D. Vance over MAGA hat, but what happens next leaves everyone speechless. The mall bustled with life as holiday shoppers scurried from store to store, their arms laden with bags of gifts. Strings of twinkling lights adorned the ceilings, and the hum of festive music mixed with the murmur of conversation and laughter. Jamie Sanders, the mall manager, watched the scene unfold from the balcony above the central atrium, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. Jamie took pride in running the mall as a safe, neutral space where everyone, regardless of background, felt welcome. It wasn't always easy. Jamie had spent years crafting an environment that balanced inclusivity with practicality. The mall was, after all, a microcosm of the town, a town as divided as the country itself. Jamie's progressive values often clashed with some patrons' staunch conservatism, but they worked hard to navigate those tensions. Today, though, a new challenge loomed. Jamie's attention was drawn to a figure entering the atrium. It was a man in his mid-40s, tall and sharply dressed, with a purposeful stride. His bright red "Make America Great Again" hat stood out like a beacon, catching the eyes of shoppers. Some turned away with visible discomfort, while others whispered to companions, nodding toward the man. A few even offered small, approving smiles. The man was J.D. Vance, supporter of the MAGA movement. Jamie's stomach tightened. They knew his presence would spark controversy. The mall's policy was clear: no displays of political affiliation that could disrupt the inclusive environment. Jamie sighed, put down the coffee, and descended the stairs. Reaching the ground floor, Jamie approached Vance, weaving through the crowd. The man stopped in front of a jewelry store, seemingly oblivious to the attention he was drawing. Jamie cleared their throat. "Excuse me, sir," Jamie began, their tone polite but firm. "Welcome to the mall. I couldn't help but notice your hat. I need to ask you to remove it while you're here." Vance turned to Jamie, his expression one of mild surprise. "Remove my hat?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with incredulity. "Yes," Jamie replied. "Our policy is to maintain a neutral and welcoming space for everyone. We avoid overt political symbols or messages that might make others feel uncomfortable." Vance folded his arms, his brow furrowing. "I'm sorry, but this is a public space, isn't it? I'm not causing a disturbance. I'm just wearing a hat." Jamie nodded, trying to remain composed as a few passers-by slowed to watch the interaction. "I understand your perspective, Mr. Vance, but we've found that certain symbols can lead to tension among patrons. It's about keeping the peace and ensuring everyone feels safe." "And you think my hat makes people unsafe?" Vance asked, his voice rising slightly. "This hat represents millions of Americans who feel left behind. It's not about division. It's about standing up for what we believe in." Jamie opened their mouth to respond, but by now a small crowd had gathered. Some people whispered to one another, while others raised their phones, recording the exchange. Jamie's cheeks flushed, but they pressed on. "I'm not questioning your beliefs, Mr. Vance. This is about maintaining the environment we've worked hard to build. I'm asking you to respect that." Vance's jaw tightened. "And what about my rights? I have the right to express myself just like anyone else. Are you going to ask someone to remove a pride flag pin or a shirt that says Black Lives Matter?" Jamie hesitated. "Our policy applies to anything that might disrupt the sense of neutrality here. We've had to address similar situations in the past. It's not personal." "It feels personal." Vance shot back, his tone sharper now. "This hat means something to me, and I won't take it off." The tension in the air was palpable. The crowd around them had grown larger, with voices murmuring louder. A woman in the back called out, "Let him wear the hat," while a man near the front muttered, "It's just common decency." Jamie glanced at the onlookers, their stomachs sinking. They had no intention of creating a spectacle, but the situation was spiraling out of control. Finally, they made a decision. "I'm sorry, Mr. Vance," Jamie said, their voice firm. "If you won't comply with our policy, I'll have to ask you to leave." Vance stared at Jamie for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "If that's how you want to play it," he said. "Fine." Security guards appeared, stepping forward to escort him out. As Vance turned to leave, he paused at the mall's main entrance, facing the crowd that had now grown to nearly 50 people. His voice rang out, calm, but filled with emotion. "I grew up in a trailer park," he began, his words silencing the murmurs. "I was raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. This hat isn't about hate or division for me. It's about the hope that people like my mom and families like mine won't be forgotten. I wear it because it reminds me of where I came from and what I'm fighting for." The crowd stood still, captivated. Some people lowered their phones, while others exchanged glances, their expressions softening. Jamie watched from a distance, conflicted. They hadn't expected this. The vulnerability, the rawness of his words. It was impossible to ignore the humanity behind them. Vance took a deep breath, adjusting his hat. "I'll leave, as you've asked, but I hope you'll think about what this means, not just for me, but for everyone in this town." With that, he stepped outside, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind him. For a moment, the mall was eerily quiet. Then the crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads, others deep in thought. Jamie stood frozen, their heart pounding. They had followed the rules, upheld the policy, but at what cost? As the hum of the mall resumed, Jamie knew one thing for certain: this was far from over. By the next morning, the confrontation at the mall was everywhere. The shaky, smartphone-recorded video of J.D. Vance being escorted out, followed by his emotional speech, had gone viral. Local news outlets picked it up first, framing the story as a clash of values. A progressive mall manager enforcing a strict policy versus a conservative businessman defending his freedom of expression. Within hours, the story had spread beyond the town, becoming a national talking point. On social media, the hashtags "Stand with Jamie" and "Free Speech for Vance" began trending. The divide was immediate and intense. Supporters of Jamie praised their courage for upholding inclusivity in the face of potential backlash, while others accused them of suppressing free speech. Meanwhile, Vance's speech at the door resonated with many who felt marginalized or ignored, fueling passionate defenses of his stance. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds, with people dissecting every moment of the video. The mall, quickly, became the focal point of the controversy. Protesters arrived within days, some holding signs that read neutrality or censorship, while others displayed banners supporting Jamie's decision. The food court, once filled with families and holiday shoppers, now buzzed with heated debates. Local business owners in the mall were caught in the crossfire. Some voiced their support for Jamie, while others worried the incident would harm their sales during the crucial holiday season. Jamie watched the chaos unfold from the second-floor office overlooking the atrium. It was a place they had always considered a sanctuary, but now it felt like a spotlight. Emails flooded their inbox, some supportive, others angry. A particularly biting message accused Jamie of turning the mall into a battleground for political ideologies. That line stuck with them. Was that what they had done? Or had they simply upheld the policy they'd always believed in? Alone. In the office late one evening, Jamie leaned back in their chair and closed their eyes, trying to make sense of the situation. They had always been proud of their commitment to inclusivity. It wasn't just a professional value, it was personal. Jamie's mind drifted back to their teenage years, growing up in a small conservative town not far from here. They remembered the sting of being excluded, first as a queer kid, then as an outspoken young adult who challenged the status quo. Jamie had fought hard for acceptance, carving out a space for themselves in a world that often felt hostile. That fight was why they had pushed so hard for the mall's neutrality policy. It wasn't about suppressing expression. It was about creating a space where no one had to feel what they had felt back then. But now, watching the fallout of their decisions spiral out of control, Jamie couldn't help but wonder if they had gone too far. Had they misunderstood Vance's intentions? Could they have handled the situation differently? Jamie sighed, rubbing their temples. It was hard to shake the guilt. Every time they thought back to Vance's speech, a pang of doubt crept in. For the first time in years, Jamie wasn't sure if they had done the right thing. Meanwhile, Vance sat across from his close friend and confidant, David, in the corner booth of a quiet diner on the edge of town. He'd spent the past few days dodging calls from reporters and well-wishers alike. The attention wasn't entirely unwelcome. He had built his career on standing up for what he believed in. But this time, the situation felt different. "It's not the hat," Vance said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "It's what it represents to people, what it's come to symbolize. That's what frustrates me." David nodded, listening intently. "You mean how people jump to conclusions about you the moment they see it?" "Exactly," Vance said, his tone sharpening. "I get it. I really do. The hat's become a lightning rod. People see it and think they know everything about me, my values, my intentions. But that's not fair. For me, it's about where I come from, about standing up for the forgotten people in towns like ours. That's what I was trying to say." "And you think they heard you?" David asked. Vance shook his head. "Maybe a few did, but for most it's just another excuse to argue. And the mall manager, Jamie, they probably think I'm just some guy looking for attention, but that's not it at all." "So, what are you going to do about it?" David asked, leaning forward. "Let it blow over, or try to set the record straight?" Vance stared out the window, watching the snow fall lightly on the empty street. He didn't have an answer, not yet. 2 days later, Jamie sat at their desk, scrolling through yet another wave of emails and social media notifications. Their phone buzzed, and they glanced at the screen to see an unexpected message from an old acquaintance, Laura, who worked as a community organizer in town. "Jamie, I saw the news. I know things are crazy, but I have an idea. Call me." Intrigued, Jamie dialed her number. Laura picked up on the first ring. "Jamie, I've been thinking about what happened," Laura said, skipping pleasantries. "And I think you need to talk to him, to Vance." Jamie nearly dropped the phone. "What? Why?" "Because this isn't just about a hat or a policy anymore," Laura said. "It's about the divide in this town. Everyone's talking about you two like you're on opposite sides of a war. But I know you, Jamie. You don't want to be part of a fight. You want solutions, and I think Vance does too." Jamie hesitated, their mind racing. The idea of sitting down with Vance felt daunting. They had been cast as adversaries, polar opposites in the eyes of the public. Could they even have a constructive conversation? But the more they thought about it, the more it made sense. If they could find common ground, maybe they could start to de-escalate the tension. "Okay," Jamie said finally, "but how do I even reach him?" "Leave that to me," Laura said. "I know someone who can connect you two. Just promise me you'll hear him out." Jamie agreed, though the knot in their stomach tightened. They had no idea what to expect, but they knew they had to try. Later that evening, Vance received a call from David, who had spoken with Laura about the proposal. Vance listened in silence as David explained Jamie's desire to meet, to have a real conversation away from the cameras and the chaos. "So, what do you think?" David asked when he finished. Vance sighed. "I don't know. Part of me feels like it's a trap, like they just want to make themselves look better." "Maybe," David said. "But what if it's not? What if Jamie really wants to understand where you're coming from? You always talk about how we need dialogue instead of shouting matches. This could be your chance to show that." Vance mulled it over, the weight of the past week pressing down on him. He thought about Jamie's face during the confrontation. Firm, but not unkind. He thought about his speech at the mall entrance, the way the crowd had gone silent. Maybe there was a way to turn all of this into something meaningful. "All right," Vance said finally. "I'll do it. Set it up." David smiled. "Good. Let's see if we can make something good come out of this mess." The small cafe on the edge of town was far removed from the bustling mall or the spotlight of controversy. It was a quiet place with soft lighting and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee lingering in the air. Jamie arrived first, their hands gripping a mug of tea as they glanced nervously at the door. The last week had been a whirlwind, public scrutiny, heated debates, and endless self-reflection. This meeting felt like a lifeline, a chance to steer the narrative toward something constructive. But it was also a risk. The door chimed, and Jamie looked up. J.D. Vance entered, his presence commanding yet subdued. He wasn't wearing the infamous MAGA hat, but his tailored coat and purposeful stride carried the same air of quiet defiance. Spotting Jamie, he gave a small nod and walked over. "Thanks for meeting me," Jamie said as Vance sat down across from them. They extended a hand, and after a brief pause, Vance shook it firmly. "I wasn't sure I would," Vance admitted. "But I'm here." Jamie nodded. "I appreciate it. I think we both know this situation has spiraled into something bigger than either of us expected." "That's putting it lightly," Vance said, leaning back in his chair. "I've been called everything from a hero to a fascist in the last few days. I imagine you've had your share of that too." Jamie chuckled dryly. "Let's just say my inbox has been interesting." For a moment they shared a smile. The tension between them softened, if only slightly. Jamie took a deep breath, deciding to go first. "Look," they began. "I know we got off on the wrong foot at the mall. I was enforcing a policy I truly believe in. A policy meant to make the mall a neutral space where no one feels alienated. But I've been thinking a lot about how I handled it. Watching your speech at the door, it made me realize I might not have fully understood where you were coming from." Vance's expression remained guarded, but his eyes softened. "I appreciate you saying that," he replied. "I know the hat is polarizing. I'm not blind to that. But for me, it's not just a political statement, it's personal. It's a reminder of where I came from, of the people I grew up with who feel forgotten." Jamie tilted their head. "Forgotten how?" Vance sighed, folding his hands on the table. "I grew up in a working-class family. My mom worked long hours, and we struggled to make ends meet. When I put on that hat, it's not about endorsing every policy or statement tied to it. It's about standing up for people like my family, people who've been left behind by politicians on both sides." Jamie listened intently, nodding. "I get that, more than you might think." They hesitated, then added, "I grew up feeling left out too, though for different reasons. I'm queer, and in a town like ours, that wasn't exactly easy. I spent most of my teenage years hiding who I was. That's part of why I care so much about creating spaces where everyone feels safe." Vance studied Jamie, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said slowly, "it's funny. On the surface, we're as different as two people can be. But the more I hear your story, the more I see the parallels. We both grew up feeling like we didn't belong, like the world wasn't made for us. And now we're both trying to fix that in our own ways." Jamie smiled faintly. "I guess you're right. It's just the ways we're going about it are so different." "Different, sure," Vance said, "but maybe not incompatible." That comment hung in the air for a moment, heavy with possibility. Jamie leaned forward, their hands clasped tightly around their mug. "That's why I wanted to meet," they said. "This town and this country is so divided. People aren't listening to each other anymore. It's just shouting matches and hashtags. I think we both want something better than that." Vance nodded. "But how do we get there? It's not like one conversation's going to change everything." Jamie hesitated, then took a leap. What if we did something together? Something public, something that shows people it's possible to have a real dialogue, even when you don't agree on everything. Vance raised an eyebrow. What are you suggesting? A town hall, Jamie said. At the mall. We bring people together, different backgrounds, different beliefs, and have an open conversation. No shouting, no name-calling, just listening and talking. Vance looked skeptical. You think people would actually go for that? Everyone's so entrenched in their own camps. They might, Jamie said, especially if we lead by example. If we can sit down and talk like this, if we can show people that it's possible, they might be willing to try too. Vance leaned back, his arms crossed. He was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing the idea. It's a risk, he said finally. What if it backfires? What if it just turns into another spectacle? It's a risk, Jamie agreed. But so is doing nothing. Right now, this town is tearing itself apart over what happened at the mall. If we can give people a way to come together instead of tearing each other down, isn't that worth trying? Vance's gaze met Jamie's, and for the first time, his guarded demeanor cracked. He looked thoughtful, almost hopeful. You're serious about this, aren't you? I am, Jamie said. I know it won't be easy, but I think it's worth it. Vance exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. All right, he said at last. I'll do it, but on one condition. What's that? Jamie asked. This has to be about the community, Vance said. Not about us. It's not about proving who's right or wrong. It's about giving people a space to be heard, Jamie smiled. I wouldn't have it any other way. They shook hands again, this time with a sense of mutual respect. As they left the cafe, the snow falling softly around them, both Jamie and Vance felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time since the incident at the mall, the path forward didn't feel so bleak. It felt like a chance, however small, to bridge the divide. The announcement of the town hall sent ripples through the community. Flyers appeared in coffee shops, posts circulated on social media, and local news ran stories about the unlikely collaboration between Jamie and J.D. Vance. The event, set to take place in the mall's spacious atrium, promised to be an evening of dialogue and understanding, but not everyone saw it that way. Criticism poured in from both sides. Supporters of Jamie, who had praised their decision to uphold the mall's neutrality policy, were confused, some even angry. Why are you giving him a platform? One email read. This feels like a betrayal of your principles. On the other hand, Vance's conservative backers expressed skepticism, questioning why he would participate in an event that might water down his convictions. Don't let them use you to push their agenda. One comment warned. Despite the noise, Jamie and Vance stayed committed. They both knew the town hall was a gamble, but they believed in the potential for something transformative. As the date approached, the mall buzzed with activity. Chairs were set up in neat rows in the atrium, microphones tested, and local volunteers helped with logistics. The tension in the air was palpable. Would people show up? Would they listen? Or would the event dissolve into chaos? By the time the event began, the atrium was packed. The crowd was a patchwork of the town's diverse population. Young activists in T-shirts emblazoned with slogans, older veterans in worn jackets adorned with patches, business owners, teachers, and families. Some attendees wore expressions of curiosity, others of suspicion. The tension was visible in the way people avoided eye contact, sticking close to their respective groups. Jamie and Vance stood together near the podium, scanning the crowd. Jamie, dressed in a simple blazer, took a deep breath and whispered to Vance, "Ready?" "As I'll ever be," Vance replied, adjusting his tie. The microphones crackled as Jamie stepped forward. "Good evening, everyone," they began, their voice steady but tinged with nervousness. "Thank you all for coming tonight. I know this hasn't been an easy week for our community. And I know many of you are here with strong feelings on all sides of the issue. That's okay. That's why we're here, to listen, to talk, and hopefully to find some common ground. They paused, glancing at Vance, who took his cue to step forward. I want to echo what Jamie said, Vance began, his deep voice commanding attention. This isn't about winning an argument or proving someone wrong. It's about understanding. Over the past week, I've had a lot of time to reflect on the divide that exists in our town and in our country. It's easy to see each other as enemies, but I believe we have more in common than we realize. Their words set the tone, and, after a brief introduction, the floor was opened to the audience. A middle-aged woman stood first, clutching the microphone with trembling hands. I own a small bakery downtown, she began, her voice wavering. This last year has been so hard. Between inflation and the fear of offending customers with even the smallest decision, I feel like I'm walking on eggshells every day. I just want to focus on my work, but everything feels so politicized. Heads nodded around the room, and Jamie smiled encouragingly. Thank you for sharing that, they said. I think a lot of people here can relate to feeling that pressure. A young man in the back raised his hand next. I'm a community organizer, he said firmly. I spend my days fighting for people who've been ignored or excluded, people who don't have the privilege to stay neutral. When I hear someone say they don't want politics in their lives, I can't help but wonder, do you understand what it's like for those of us who don't have that choice? The air grew heavy as murmurs rippled through the crowd. Vance stepped forward. I hear you, he said, and I think your work is important. But I also think there are a lot of people who feel exhausted by the constant division, who just want to feel like they belong without having to pick a side. The young man nodded thoughtfully, and the conversation moved on. One by one, people stepped up to share their stories. Stories of economic struggles, of feeling unheard, of navigating a world where everything seemed to carry a political weight. Jamie and Vance listened intently, occasionally chiming in to connect the dots between different perspectives. Slowly, the mood began to shift. The initial wariness was replaced by something softer, curiosity. About halfway through the evening, tension flared when an older veteran and a young activist clashed over a heated topic. The veteran, a stout man with a deep voice, spoke passionately about his pride in serving the country. I wore the uniform because I believed in something bigger than myself, he said. It breaks my heart to see people disrespecting the flag and tearing this country apart. The activist, a woman in her 20s with bright blue hair, shot back. You think we're tearing the country apart? We're trying to fix it. Just because someone kneels during the anthem doesn't mean they hate the country. It means they want it to be better. The room grew tense as their voices rose. Jamie stepped in, gently raising a hand. Wait, they said. Can we take a moment to pause? I hear both of you saying that you care deeply about this country, but it sounds like you're expressing that care in different ways. Can you tell each other why you feel the way you do? The veteran hesitated, then spoke. I grew up in a small town working on a farm. Joining the military gave me purpose, a sense of pride. It's hard to see people criticizing something that means so much to me. The activist softened. I get that, she said. But for me, it's about holding the country accountable to its promises. I love this place too, but I want it to be better for everyone. The room was silent as the two looked at each other, the hostility in their faces replaced by something closer to understanding. Slowly, the veteran extended his hand. I respect that, he said, and I respect you. The activist shook his hand, tears glistening in her eyes. The crowd erupted into applause, some people wiping away their own tears. It was a small moment, but it carried the weight of something much larger. For the first time that night, the divide didn't feel insurmountable. The breakthrough seemed to unlock something in the room. One by one, people began finding connections where they hadn't before. A small business owner and a labor organizer discovered they shared concerns about rising rents. A teacher and a parent bonded over their struggles to navigate a divisive school board. Conversations that had started with tension began to end with smiles, handshakes, even hugs. As the evening wound down, Jamie and Vance stood together at the podium once more. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Jamie said. "This isn't the end of the conversation. It's the beginning. Let's keep listening, keep talking, and keep finding ways to come together." Vance added, "We've seen tonight that it's possible to bridge divides, even when it feels impossible. Let's take what we've learned here and carry it forward, not just in this mall, but in our homes, our workplaces, and our community." The crowd rose in a standing ovation. For the first time in weeks, the town felt less like a battleground and more like a place where healing was possible. And as Jamie and Vance looked out at the sea of faces, diverse, imperfect, and hopeful, they knew they had taken the first step towards something better.